Okay, we've been talking about cells. What I want to know is how'd they get here? Okay? How did the first cells, how did the first life come to exist on planet Earth? It's a profound question, and one that has been at the crux of human existence ever since there have been humans able to contemplate such things. How did life get here on planet Earth? How did these things we call cells get here on planet Earth? It's a really hard question to grapple with. And I don't want you to confuse it with what we talked about when we talked about evolution. Evolution, the changes that life has gone through on planet Earth since it has existed on planet Earth, are comparatively well documented. We can look at the fossil record and we can see how life has changed over time. We can look at the DNA of organisms and compare DNA of a variety of organisms and see where they are similar, where they're different, and see where they have common ancestry. And we can map this out. If we are patient enough and dutiful enough about it, we can plot out the evolutionary changes that have occurred on Earth. We're working on it in this very moment, and we'll work on it for many years to come. But it's doable. This whole thing about the origin of life is another story. Please don't let anyone confuse these two ideas for you. The origin of life does not have ready evidence that we can look at and talk about. It just doesn't. There are ideas about it. There are hypotheses that we can work with, but there is no real evidence, at least that I know of currently, that shows us how life got started on the planet. And there's really not likely to be much. So can we study it scientifically? Yes, at least aspects of it. Now, there are many hypotheses about how life got here. One of the most famous hypotheses about how life got here is that it was specially created by a divine force, God, whatever you wish to call it. And that is quite enough for many people. Many people look out and see the amazingness of life and say, God put it here and that's that. And that's fine. But as scientists, we can't do anything with that. It's not testable. It is not a testable hypothesis. We cannot develop a scientific test that is going to tell us whether God is present or absent, or whether God created life or not. There is no test for God. So as valid as it may be for anyone, it is just not a scientific thing that it's not testable in terms of science. So we can't play that game, okay? It's not that science says that's not possible. Science makes no comment on that because it can't. It is not a testable hypothesis. So we have to leave that alone. Now, some folks have a hypothesis that life originated in space and traveled here. Now, please don't be thinking little green men in spaceships. That's not what this is about, though I'm sure some people believe that too. Extraterrestrial origins suggest that the stuff that life is made of was brought to Earth aboard meteorites and comets and things, and it is from those seeds of organic compounds that life eventually arose. That's a testable hypothesis. Now, when I say testable, I mean we can see if that is a possibility. We probably will never be able to say with certainty that that is definitely how life got here on Earth, or it is definitely not. But we can see if it is possible. We can have a testable hypothesis for that. And another hypothesis, and this is the one that we're really going to talk about most or entirely almost in this podcast, is the spontaneous abiotic. Abiotic means a, without, bio, life. Spontaneous abiotic origin of life, meaning life got here from non-living stuff. How could that be? Okay? life spontaneously form from inorganic, non-living, not even organic compounds? How could it do that? Well, it is a testable hypothesis. Again, we will probably never be able to say conclusively, yep, that's how life came to be. But we can test it and say, is it possible that life arose this way? Okay? So, remember, if we want to say, do we have a living thing? Is life arising here in this way? First, we have to define what we mean by life. We mean cells first and foremost. We define life as being made of cells, okay? It can respond to stimuli. It can maintain homeostasis, internal conditions that are constant and very often different from the environment. Living things use energy all the time for all kinds of purposes, often to grow. They develop, meaning living things change over time. You are not the same as you were 18 years ago or 17 years ago. You started out as a zygote. Living things are able to reproduce and, importantly, pass on their genetic information, heredity, from one generation to the next. Using DNA or RNA, and living things evolve. So life is really a cluster of characteristics that we look at something and we say, well, can it do this? Can it do this? Can it do this? Can it do this? Okay, then it's probably a living thing then. It has to meet a constellation of criteria to be considered alive. Now, so if we know what we're looking for, what a living thing, what characteristics it would possess, then how do we get there? If we are talking about this idea of abiotic life from non-life, this is called abiogenesis. You might want to note that abiogenesis means creation of life from non-life, without life, creation of life from non-life. Okay, how could we do that? We've got to go through some steps to get there. First, we'd have to, if Earth starts out very simply with lots of inorganic compounds, where do those first simple organic compounds come from? How do they get here? Today we know living things make most of these organic compounds. Well, how would they have gotten here without life? And when I say simple organic compounds, I mean things like the monomers we've been talking about, the amino acids, the nucleotides, things like that. We've got to get those created first. We've got to get the Legos before we can start building the tower. How did those things get here? And once those things were here, how would we have, Earth have put those together into more complex forms, into the polymers, the proteins, the nucleotides, and lipids, and things like that we are familiar with? And once we got these complex molecules, these polymers, how would we have gotten these compartments that we now recognize as cells? And once we got those, how would we have gotten the ability for cells to replicate themselves and pass on their instructions for making themselves to their children? Replication, and this is really implying genetics. Okay, these are 1, 2, 3, 4 steps that life would have had to have gone through to originate on Earth. It has to, at least if it is abiotically synthesized. So, how could that even have gotten started? Well, it might have gotten started because conditions on the early Earth were really different from what we have around us today. Around us today, if we step outside or if we step inside, anywhere we go, we got oxygen, and we got lots and lots of it. In the early Earth atmosphere, not so much. There was not oxygen. In fact, oxygen was startlingly absent. The atmosphere in the early Earth was one called a reducing atmosphere. And I'm going to ask you to think back to any chemistry you might have taken, and I think we've talked about this a little bit. Oxidation gets its name, is a process that happens when oxygen reacts with things. And oxygen loves to react with things. Why? Because oxygen is electronegative and it loves to snag electrons wherever it can. And when it does, it usually ends up breaking things down. Think about your bicycle. If you leave your bike out over months and months, you are likely to find some rust. Why? Because the oxygen out there has been interacting with the metal on your bike and starting to break it down because it wants to interact with those atoms of molecules of metal. And so it breaks them down. And you see that as rust. That is what our atmosphere is like today. Oxygen is a destroyer. It loves to get in there and just break things down, okay? But the early Earth atmosphere was not like that. It was thought to be a reducing atmosphere, meaning exactly the opposite. There was no oxygen. And in fact, there was lots of, well, let's see what there was lots of. There was lots of water vapor. There was lots of carbon dioxide and nitrogen, much like still today. Some nitrates and nitrites, hydrogen gas, which is not in our atmosphere today. Ammonia, not so much either. You don't want to go outside and take a deep breath of ammonia. That's like standing next to the litter box. We don't want to do that. Methane. Methane is what's in the all-star ingredient in cow farts. Don't want to be breathing that a whole lot either. Hydrogen sulfide, that's in marsh mud. When you go to the marsh and you smell this really rotten egg type smell, this is what the early Earth atmosphere was like. And this is called a reducing atmosphere in that none of these items here are going to act to strip electrons away. And so if more complex molecules form, they might be allowed to stay that way. They aren't going to be stripped apart. That's why organic compounds don't spontaneously form. And when I say organic compounds, again, I'm meaning like amino acids and things like that. Don't just spontaneously form out in the environment anymore because oxygen will just break them down. Living things have to create organic compounds today because our entire environment is different. But in this reducing atmosphere, scientists think it is possible that organic compounds could have spontaneously formed, okay? There was lots of hydrogen available and there was no oxygen to break the stuff down, okay? Also, there were energy sources available, lots of energy sources available to kind of push these molecules that we would want to make together, these first organic molecules together. Lightning was copious in the early atmosphere. There were volcanic eruptions that sent plumes of ash into the air, and their friction together would create enormous lightning storms. UV radiation was prevalent because the ozone, you remember ozone, O3, that protects us. It's a layer in the atmosphere that protects us from UV radiation. It sends it back, or at least most of it, back into space. That hadn't formed yet. So UV radiation was, high energy radiation was pounding the Earth. And that was a source of energy too. So there was energy to knock these molecules or atoms together, and there was nothing to rip them apart because there was no oxygen in the atmosphere if they did come together. Okay? Now, there were some hypotheses. The first guys to make a hypothesis about abiotic or abiogenesis, abiotic synthesis of life, or not life so much as the first organic compounds that life might one day be made of, were in 1920, these two guys, Oparin and Haldane, proposed the reducing atmosphere hypothesis. They said that if the atmosphere was reducing, then it might be conducive, actually, to making organic compounds. It might have been a favorable environment for them to get made. Now, they didn't test their hypothesis. It was like 33 years later, in 1953, two other scientists, Miller and Urey, actually tested this hypothesis. And they did so with this crazy lab setup. And what they did was they had some ocean water, some water to mimic the ocean, okay? And they heated it a little bit, not boiling, but heat like you would expect for evaporation to occur. And some of the water would evaporate. And it would drift over into a little chamber that basically emulated the early Earth atmosphere, with lots of methane, hydrogen gas, ammonia gas, and so on. And some electricity. These electrodes would have added lightning sparks to this early atmosphere. And then they would let it cool, this atmospheric mess of water and so on to cool, and they would let it drip down almost as though it's raining down into another little chamber where they would collect the particle, the solution out of this chamber and see what was there. And what they found was organic molecules where there had been none in this whole setup before. They found that if they had a reducing atmosphere, a little electricity, and a little water, they could form simple organic molecules like amino acids and some nucleotides. So, is that how the first organic compounds got on Earth? Maybe. It's possible. We can't know for certain that that's how it occurred, but it is a testable hypothesis, and it was found to be a possibility. Stanley Miller is shown here with this apparatus. You can see the electrodes giving a little lightning off there. Here's a bigger picture of the apparatus, and you can see that it made amino acids, hydrocarbons like fatty acids, and nitrogenous bases found in nucleotides, and other organic compounds. So it did make some of these simple organic compounds. Now this idea of Miller and Urey and Opper and Haldane suggests the atmosphere and the surface of the earth, the surface of the oceans is where life might, or these organic compounds might have first formed. Some say this probably is not where life first formed because they don't, some scientists today don't think the early earth atmosphere was as reducing as they used to think. And that probably life maybe could have formed in pockets really near volcanoes where lots of these gases would have been coming out of the volcanoes. Some think the most likely place life evolved, organic compounds might have first arose was at deep sea vents, and that life might actually have arisen at these deep sea vents because you have all the right ingredients there. Possibilities, and I would invite you to explore them, but we kind of need to move on. Extraterrestrial origin of organic compounds. Certainly, this is testable. We test meteorites that come from outer space and strike Earth, and they do contain organic compounds, and there's a whole lot of talk about this that you can look up if you're interested, but we kind of just need to move on. All right? Now, next step. So we've got simple organic molecules. We would have to get more complex. If you'll recall, we need to get those monomers to make polymers. Is that possible without living things there to do it? It is. It has been shown scientifically to make possible. You'll add a little heat to some monomers and you can get them to join together. Heat, remember, can be a catalyst and cause things to come together. So it is possible to get monomers to come together and make more complex polymers. But once we have polymers, is it possible to get polymers to make cells? That seems a pretty big leap of complexity. Well, remember what we said about phospholipids. Phospholipids will spontaneously orient themselves so that the polar heads face the water, and fatty acid tails face inward, and we can get this bilayer. And that happens quite spontaneously. So if you have these chemicals and you have water, it is quite possible to get these primitive bubbles forming, and you can do that in a lab. These things that you get are called protobionts. If they are made of lipids, we often call them liposomes. You don't need to know that. But you can get these bubbles to spontaneously form. Does that mean you have life? Not yet. Not unless it's doing some metabolic activity, not unless it's able to reproduce itself. But study of these protobionts has shown that you can, if you kind of capture some chemicals in the bubble, like perhaps an enzyme or two, you can get some primitive metabolic activity occurring in the bubbles. The bubbles can make baby bubbles and reproduce themselves. It's not heredity, that we've got to get some DNA in there to be able to say truly we are going to pass our traits of this bubble onto the baby bubble. But we can see the beginnings perhaps of compartmentalizing primitive cellular-like activities in these little bubbles, okay? It's a big leap to go from here to actual cells, but scientists have shown that we can get these primitive cell-like bubbles to form in the lab and to have some very simple metabolic activity or very, very simple reproductive-like activity in a lab setting. So we can test the hypothesis to see if it's possible. Okay? Now, but really important is the ability of a living thing to pass its traits to its offspring. That really is almost the quintessential life characteristic, the origin of genetics. And it is thought that likely, we always associate DNA with genes, but it is likely thought that DNA was probably not the first genetic material, that the first genetic material was probably RNA. And you will see why when we talk about our genetics unit a little bit later on. But RNA is a single-stranded molecule that can fold in complex ways. We know DNA is always this twisted ladder shape like that. But RNA can take on some pretty crazy shapes, very similar to the shapes that proteins can take. And thus, it can act like an enzyme. Why is that important, that RNA can act like an enzyme? Because in order to make RNA or a genetic material, you need to be able to build it in a reliable way. And if RNA could catalyze its own copying, then you've solved a huge problem. So it is thought that RNA is probably the first genetic material because, yes, it is able to code genetic information, but it is also able to copy itself because it acts as its own enzymes as well. We'll talk about these words later. Just understand that RNA is an amazing molecule that can do lots of things, and it is thought that it could probably copy itself, and thus natural selection would now have something to act on. It's got a genetic material that can copy itself, and natural selection can say, oh, this is good genetic material creating good traits, and this is bad genetic material making bad traits, and then off you go. Once you've got that ability for natural selection to act on inherited traits, then you're off to the races. Okay? All right, I'm going to stop there, and then we'll kind of take a little trip through the origin of life on planet Earth. Okay, so you're not done yet, but we'll break it up a little bit so you don't have to kill yourself. All right, thank you very much. I'll see you in the next podcast.